Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep into the sometimes mysterious world of endocrine disorders.
Yeah, it's really amazing how just the tiniest bit of hormone imbalance can have a pretty huge impact all throughout your body.
It really is. Our sources for this deep dive are really diverse. We have, of course, the latest clinical research, but we also have some interesting patient stories as well as a little historical perspective. I think it's really going to help paint a clearer picture. We'll be talking about a lot of different conditions today, but I think what ties them all together is this. Either too much or too little of a specific hormone can really throw your whole body out of whack.
Yeah, and that can happen in a couple ways, right?
Hi.
Either a gland just isn't producing enough, or maybe the problem is with the receptors, so the cells can't get the message.
Right. So to get started, let's head straight to the control center, often called the master gland, the pituitary gland. Why is this little gland so powerful?
Well, it's really all about location. It's located right at the base of your brain. You can kind of think of it as the main communication hub, taking in messages from the brain and then sending out hormonal instructions.
It's really amazing that such a small structure can have such a huge impact on so many different systems. Now, let's talk about one specific condition that's linked to the pituitary. Acromegaly. What is that exactly?
Oh, acromegaly is a great example of what happens when hormone production goes a little bit crazy. In this case, it's an excess of growth hormone, but in adults.
Hmm.
You can imagine, like, the growth switch gets flipped on, and then it just kind of gets stuck.
So even though someone's finished growing, their body's still getting those signals to grow. What
Yeah,
happens?
exactly. What we see is people start to have enlargement in certain areas, especially their hands, feet, and even their facial features change. And of course, it's not only on the outside. We see headaches, sometimes vision problems, and even sleep apnea. And again, it all stems back to this overgrowth.
So I imagine getting a diagnosis for this could be quite a shock. How do doctors figure out what's going on?
It does often start with just noticing the physical changes, but a glucose tolerance test is usually the first step. Basically, it's seeing how the body handles sugar. If someone has acromegaly, the growth hormone interferes with that whole process. And then we use imaging, like CT or MRI scans, to actually locate the source, which is often a tumor on the pituitary itself.
So you've got this growth switch that's basically stuck. What do you do about that?
There are a few options. Sometimes we do need surgery to remove the tumor. Other times, radiation might be enough to shrink it. And we also have some medications that can block the effects of that excess growth hormone. It all depends on the individual patient.
So we've talked about the anterior pituitary. What about the posterior pituitary? What does it do?
The posterior pituitary is pretty interesting. It's like a storage and release center, basically holding on to two key hormones that are made in the hypothalamus.
Hmm.
ADH, which is all about water balance, and then oxytocin, which most people know as the love hormone.
And if those get out of balance, things can go a little haywire.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Take SIADH, for example. That stands for Syndrome of Inappropriate Antidiuretic Hormone. It's like your body's water regulation system is stuck on high, so it just keeps holding on to water.
So it's like your body just can't get rid of the extra water. What happens then?
Well, you're going to feel super bloated and sluggish, for one thing. Urine output goes way down, and as all that water builds up, the sodium levels in your blood drop. That's called hyponatremia, and that can be dangerous because if it gets too low, it can actually mess with nerve function, and we start to see seizures.
Wow, seizures from too much water. I would have never thought of that. So how do you treat SIADH?
It all comes down to finding the root cause, first of all, which could be a head injury or maybe a tumor. But while we're figuring that out, doctors will restrict fluid intake, maybe prescribe diuretics to help flush out the excess water. And sometimes in severe cases, we have to give hypertonic saline. That's basically a concentrated salt solution to bring those sodium levels back up. And of course, keeping a really close eye on those electrolytes is super important.
So we've talked about having too much ADH, which causes the body to hold on to too much water. What about if there's not enough ADH, or maybe the kidneys just aren't responding to it properly?
Well, then we're talking about diabetes insipidus, DI for short. And yeah, it's basically the exact opposite of SIADH. Instead of holding on to water, it's like you just spring a leak and can't stop losing it.
And that can cause some pretty uncomfortable symptoms, I imagine.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We see people with excessive urination, sometimes up to 20 quarts a day,
Yeah.
and they're losing all that fluid, so they're constantly thirsty, and dehydration becomes a big concern.
How do you fix a leak like that?
Well, the first step is figuring out why it's happening. There are two main types of DI. Central DI is caused by a problem in the brain, and nephrogenic DI is when the kidneys just aren't responding to the ADH properly. So for central DI, we might give a synthetic form of ADH called desmopressin. But for nephrogenic DI, we have to focus on managing those fluid and electrolyte imbalances. And believe it or not, sometimes we even use diuretics for that. It seems counterintuitive, but it can actually help.
It's fascinating how the same medication can be used for two completely opposite conditions. Okay, so we've talked about the pituitary. Let's move on to the butterfly-shaped gland in your neck, the thyroid. The thyroid is so important for energy, growth, and development, but what happens when it starts to malfunction?
One of the most common problems we see is a goiter, which is just a fancy way of saying an enlarged thyroid. That can happen because the thyroid's overactive, producing too much hormone, or underactive, not producing enough. Interestingly, worldwide, one of the biggest culprits is iodine deficiency, but that's not as common in the US. Here, we usually see other things causing thyroid problems.
So when we talk about hyperthyroidism, that basically means the body's stuck in overdrive.
That's a great way to put it. Everything just speeds up. The most common type is Graves' disease. That's an autoimmune condition where the body basically attacks the thyroid and then it overproduces hormones. And there's a really severe form called thyroid storm or thyrotoxicosis, which can actually be life-threatening.
Thyroid storm, that sounds pretty intense. What does that look like?
It's like your metabolism just goes into hyperdrive. You get this super high fever, your heart's racing, blood pressure shoots way up, and even your mental state changes. Lots of things can trigger it, like stress, infection, even having surgery. It's a true medical emergency, and it needs immediate treatment.
So there are all these different forms of hyperthyroidism. How do you get that overactive thyroid back in check?
There are quite a few approaches, actually. Medications are used to manage symptoms and block some of that hormone production. We can use radioactive iodine to destroy some of that overactive thyroid tissue. And sometimes we even have to remove part or all of the thyroids surgically. The tricky thing is, all of these treatments can then lead to hypothyroidism, which means the person will need to take thyroid hormone replacement for the rest of their life.
It's like trading one set of challenges for another. So speaking of hypothyroidism, what happens when the thyroid is running too slow?
Well, imagine the opposite of everything we just talked about. Your metabolism slows way down. So instead of being wired all the time, you're exhausted, you can't stand being cold,
Yeah.
and you gain weight for seemingly no reason. Your heart rate slows down too, and some people get really depressed. There are two types, just like with diabetes insipidus: primary, which means the thyroid itself isn't working right, and secondary, which means the problem's coming from the pituitary or hypothalamus, those control centers we talked about earlier.
So it's a completely different set of symptoms, but thankfully we can treat that too, right?
Thankfully, yeah. Most of the time, we can manage hypothyroidism with a synthetic thyroid hormone called levothyroxine. People usually take it once a day, and it helps to bring those hormone levels back to normal, which relieves those symptoms. Okay, so we've covered the thyroid. Are you ready to move on to the parathyroid gland?
Let's do it. The parathyroid glands are those tiny but mighty glands that regulate calcium and phosphate levels, which are crucial for all sorts of things like your bones, your nerves, everything.
Absolutely. And if those levels get messed up, it can cause big problems. Take hyperparathyroidism, for example. That's when the parathyroid glands produce too much PTH, which stands for parathyroid hormone. What happens then is your body starts pulling calcium out of your bones, which makes them weak and prone to fractures. And it's not just your bones either. That excess calcium can cause problems with other organs too.
That sounds pretty scary. How do you treat something like that?
Surgery is often the best option, and it usually involves removing the overactive parathyroid gland. That usually takes care of the calcium imbalance and gets everything back on track.
Now, what about hypoparathyroidism? What happens when there's not enough parathyroid hormone?
That one's actually not as common, and it usually happens because the parathyroid glands get damaged during a medical procedure. It causes low calcium levels, which can trigger a whole bunch of symptoms, from muscle cramps and spasms to tingling in your hands and feet and even seizures. It can be pretty rough.
So, how do you deal with low calcium levels?
The goal is to get those calcium levels back to normal, and that usually involves taking calcium supplements, either by mouth or sometimes even intravenously. It's really all about restoring balance.
Okay, so are you ready to tackle the adrenal glands, those stress-busting powerhouses? They're like little caps sitting right on top of your kidneys, and they churn out all kinds of hormones that regulate everything from your stress response to your blood pressure and even your metabolism.
Yeah, the adrenal glands are fascinating, and when things go wrong with them, it can really throw your body for a loop. They're actually made of two parts: the adrenal medulla, which produces those fight or flight hormones like adrenaline, and then the adrenal cortex, which makes a bunch of other hormones, including cortisol, aldosterone, and even some androgens.
So let's start with a condition that affects the adrenal cortex. Cushing syndrome, what's that all about?
Cushing's is a classic example of how too much of a good thing can actually be a bad thing. It basically happens when your body is exposed to high levels of cortisol for too long. That can happen because of certain medications, like prednisone, or because of a tumor that's producing extra cortisol.
And cortisol is that stress hormone everyone's always talking about, right? What happens when it's constantly elevated?
Well, you start to see some pretty noticeable physical changes. People get a rounded face, sometimes called moon face, and a fatty hump develops between their shoulders. Their skin gets thinner and bruises easily, and they might even start growing excess hair. But the changes aren't just on the outside. You get weaker, you're tired all the time, you're more prone to osteoporosis, which means your bones are weaker, and then there's high blood sugar and fluid retention. It could be a lot.
Those are some pretty big changes.
Yeah.
How do you even know if someone has Cushing's? And how do you treat something like that?
Diagnosing Cushing's usually involves checking the cortisol levels in your blood and urine. And as for treatment, well, it really depends on what's causing it. If it's a tumor, surgery might be the answer. But if it's caused by medication, we might have to adjust the dose or switch to a different medication altogether. The important thing is to remember that Cushing's isn't just about the physical symptoms. It can really affect a person's self-esteem and body image, and it's important to address that too.
Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about Addison's disease, which happens when the adrenal glands aren't producing enough of those crucial hormones. What's going on there?
Addison's disease is basically the opposite of Cushing's. It's adrenal insufficiency, which means your body isn't making enough cortisol. And often it's not making enough aldosterone either. This usually happens because of an autoimmune attack on the adrenal glands, so they basically get shut down and can't produce those hormones anymore.
What kind of effects does that have?
It can show up in a lot of different ways. People often feel weak and tired. They might get depressed, they lose weight, and their blood pressure drops. Sometimes their skin pigmentation changes too, and it gets darker or more bronze-colored.
Uh-huh.
And because aldosterone is so important for electrolyte balance, people with Addison's can have low sodium and high potassium levels, which can be dangerous if we don't catch them.
So how do you treat a condition where your body just isn't making those essential hormones?
Well, we have to replace them. Usually that means taking medications like hydrocortisone, prednisone, or cortisone.
Yeah.
Basically, we're trying to mimic what the adrenal glands would normally be doing. And it's really important to keep a close eye on things like electrolytes, blood glucose, and blood pressure throughout treatment. Just make sure everything's staying within a healthy range.
Okay, so we've covered the pituitary, the thyroid, and the parathyroid glands. Now let's move on to those fascinating powerhouses, the adrenal glands. There's a lot to unpack there.
Oh yeah, the adrenal glands are full of surprises.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're out of whack, the effects can be pretty dramatic.
Let's dive in.
You know those adrenal glands we were just talking about? They really are like your body's own personal alarm system, always ready to jump in when you're facing some sort of danger.
Right, and that fight or flight response is totally crucial for survival. But what happens when that alarm system just won't shut off, even when you're not in any real danger?
That's when we see conditions like pheochromocytoma. It's a pretty rare tumor, but it can develop in the adrenal medulla. And it basically causes this surge of adrenaline and other stress hormones,
Yeah.
even if you're just, chilling on the couch.
So it's like having those heart racing, sweaty palms, on edge feelings, but all the time.
Exactly. And that's not all. You get these awful headaches, your heart's pounding, your blood pressure goes through the roof. It could be super disruptive.
How do you even diagnose something like that when it sounds so much like just everyday anxiety?
It can be tough, that's for sure. We usually look for those stress hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and see if their levels are higher than normal in the blood or urine. And then imaging, like CT scans or MRIs, can help us pinpoint the tumor, which is often on the adrenal gland itself.
So if you've got this tumor that's basically hijacking your body's stress response, how do you treat it?
Most of the time, surgery is the way to go. We remove the tumor, and usually that's enough to get those hormone levels back to normal and those intense symptoms go away.
So we've been talking about how doctors use things like blood tests and imaging studies to figure out what's going on with these different endocrine disorders. But I'm curious, how do those hormones actually work, at the cellular level? It's wild to think that these tiny little molecules can have such a huge effect all over the body.
It really is. So hormones basically work by binding to these special receptors on target cells all throughout the body. Think of it like a key fitting into a lock. Each hormone has a unique key that only works on specific locks, which are those receptors on certain cells.
So it's not like the hormones just flood your system and every cell reacts?
Nope, not at all. It's way more targeted than that. The hormones travel through your bloodstream, but they can only affect the cells that have the right receptors.
Yeah.
And when a hormone binds to its receptor, it basically sets off a chain reaction inside the cell, which ultimately changes how that cell functions.
It's like each hormone has its own secret code, and only certain cells can crack it. It's mind-blowing how complex and precise this whole system is.
It really is. And when those signals get messed up, that's when we start to see all the symptoms and problems that come with endocrine disorders.
We've touched on some of the complications, but what are some of the bigger health implications of these hormone imbalances? It seems like they could have a ripple effect on a lot of other systems in the body.
Oh, for sure. Endocrine disorders are definitely not just about one isolated gland. They can mess with your metabolism, your growth, your mood, sleep, even your reproductive health. And it goes even further than that. They can play a role in heart disease, weakened bones, problems with fertility, and even certain types of cancer. Hormones are involved in pretty much every aspect of your health.
So it's not just about treating the symptoms you're seeing right now, but also thinking about those long-term effects on overall well-being. It seems like early diagnosis and treatment are super important in these cases.
You got it. The sooner we can figure out what's going on and address those imbalances, the better the chances of preventing some of that long-term damage and keeping people healthy.
So if someone's worried about their endocrine health, what are some things to watch out for? What kind of red flags should send them to the doctor?
Well, keep in mind that a lot of these conditions can be sneaky in the early stages. You might not even notice anything's wrong. But there are some general signs to look out for, like unexplained weight changes, whether you're gaining or losing. If you're always tired or suddenly you have all this energy you didn't have before, mood swings that seem out of character, trouble sleeping or feeling wired when you should be tired, changes in your skin, hair, or nails, digestive problems that just don't quit, and for women, changes in your menstrual cycle. Any of those things, especially if they're happening all the time or getting worse, definitely warrant a trip to the doctor.
Better safe than sorry, right? Especially when it comes to something as intricate as the endocrine system. Now, there's so much happening in medical technology these days. What's on the horizon for diagnosing and treating these conditions? Any exciting breakthroughs coming down the pipeline?
Oh, there's always something new happening in this field, which is really exciting. We're seeing some amazing progress in developing these super sensitive and specific diagnostic tools, which means we can catch these imbalances even earlier, maybe even before people even start having symptoms.
That would be incredible. What about treatment? Any
Mhm.
cool new approaches in the works?
One area that's getting a lot of attention is personalized medicine. That's basically tailoring treatments to each person's unique genetic makeup and their specific hormonal profile. So instead of this one-size-fits-all approach, we can create these custom treatment plans that target the exact underlying causes of someone's endocrine disorder.
So it's like understanding the individual nuances of each person's endocrine system and then creating a specific plan to get it back in balance. That's really fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a topic that's closely related to endocrine health: diabetes. It affects millions of people around the world, and it often involves a problem with the pancreas, which is the gland that produces insulin.
Diabetes is a great example of how just one hormone imbalance can have these huge consequences for the whole body.
Right. And there are two main types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Right. Type 1 is when the body's own immune system attacks those insulin-producing cells in the pancreas. And type 2 is usually linked to lifestyle factors and involves insulin resistance, where the body's cells aren't responding to insulin the way they should be.
Exactly. Both types involve insulin, which is the hormone that helps regulate those blood sugar levels. But the causes and the treatment are very different.
So with type 1, it's like the pancreas is under attack and it can't make insulin at all. But with type 2, it's more like the body's cells are becoming numb to insulin signals and
Yeah.
they're not listening anymore.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
And the problem is both types can lead to some really serious complications if they're not managed properly. High blood sugar can damage your blood vessels and your nerves, which can lead to problems with your heart, eyes, kidneys, even your feet. Keeping those blood sugar levels in a healthy range is absolutely crucial to prevent long-term damage.
So managing diabetes is like a lifelong commitment. What are some of the challenges people with diabetes face in keeping their condition under control?
It can be a lot, to be honest.
Yeah.
It requires a ton of vigilance and attention to detail. You have to check your blood sugar multiple times a day, adjust your insulin or medication doses constantly, think about every single thing you eat, and stay physically active. And all of that while you're trying to, you know, live your life and deal with the emotional and psychological aspects of having a chronic illness. it can be overwhelming.
It sounds really tough. What kind of resources are out there to help people with diabetes cope with all of that?
The good news is there are a ton of organizations, both national and local, that provide a lot of support and resources to people with diabetes and their families. These organizations offer education, support groups, they advocate for better policies, and they even help with financial assistance. It's all about connecting people with the tools and the support they need to live a full life.
It's good to know there's help out there. Now, I know managing blood sugar is the main focus in diabetes care, but what are some other things people with diabetes should be watching out for? Are there certain health issues where early detection can make a big difference?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Since diabetes increases the risk for a whole bunch of other health problems, it's crucial to be proactive. Heart disease is a big one. People with diabetes have a much higher risk of heart attack, stroke, and other cardiovascular problems. So managing blood pressure and cholesterol is really important.
So it's not just about blood sugar, but about taking care of your heart in general.
Exactly. And kidney disease is another big concern. High blood sugar can damage the tiny blood vessels in your kidneys, which means they can't filter waste products from your blood as well. Regular kidney function tests are super important to catch any problems early on.
It seems like the kidneys take a hit when those blood sugar levels are high. What about nerve damage? I know that's another potential complication.
Yep. High blood sugar can also damage nerves all throughout your body, which can lead to neuropathy. People with neuropathy get pain, numbness, tingling, sometimes even a loss of sensation. It usually affects the feet, legs, hands, and arms. And it can make you more likely to fall and get injured. So taking good care of your feet, wearing the right shoes, and seeing a podiatrist regularly is super important.
It's amazing how much damage high blood sugar can cause. What about vision problems? I know diabetes can affect your eyes, too.
That's right. Diabetic retinopathy is actually one of the leading causes of blindness. And it happens when high blood sugar damages those tiny blood vessels in your retina, which is the part of your eye that senses light. Regular eye exams with an ophthalmologist or an optometrist are really important to catch any changes early on and hopefully prevent vision loss.
So managing diabetes really does involve looking after your whole body. It's not just about blood sugar, but also being proactive about your heart, kidneys, nerves, and eyes.
You got it. It's about understanding that diabetes doesn't just affect one part of your body, it can affect everything. And the key to living well with diabetes is to take that whole body approach and be proactive about your overall health.
Now, it's awesome to see all the advancements in diabetes care these days. What are some of the latest breakthroughs that are giving people with diabetes more control over their condition?
One thing that's really exciting is the development of continuous glucose monitors, or CGMs for short. These devices give you real-time blood sugar readings 24/7. So instead of having to prick your finger all the time, you get this constant stream of information about how your blood sugar is doing.
So it's like having a window into your blood sugar level.
Exactly. And some of them can even be connected to insulin pumps, which creates what we call a closed-loop system. So the pump can automatically adjust the amount of insulin it's giving you based on those real-time readings. This technology has the potential to totally revolutionize diabetes management.
That sounds super promising. It's amazing how technology can make managing diabetes easier and less disruptive. Are there any other cool developments on the horizon?
Definitely. Researchers are working on all sorts of new medications and therapies, like drugs that can improve insulin sensitivity, protect the pancreas from more damage, and even try to regenerate those insulin-producing cells. And there's also a lot of interest in things like personalized nutrition plans and exercise programs, which can really empower people with diabetes to take control of their health.
So it's a combination of high-tech solutions and personalized approaches to create a more individualized plan for each person.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about the future of diabetes research. It's all about figuring out what each individual needs and then creating a plan that works for them.
Now, let's step back from diabetes for a minute and think about the endocrine system as a whole. We've been talking about all these specific disorders, but I'm wondering, are there everyday things that can throw our hormones off balance, even if we don't have an actual medical condition?
Our endocrine systems are incredibly tough and resilient, but they're also pretty sensitive. And a lot of the things we do every day, without even thinking about it, can have a big impact on our hormones.
Like what? What are some of the main culprits?
Well, stress is a big one. When you're stressed out, your body pumps out all this cortisol, which is that fight or flight hormone. Cortisol is important, but if it's high all the time, it can really disrupt the balance of other hormones, and that can lead to a whole cascade of effects.
So managing stress isn't just about feeling better emotionally, it's about protecting your hormones too.
Exactly. Finding healthy ways to deal with stress, like exercising, meditating, getting out in nature, or just hanging out with people you care about, is so important for keeping your hormones balanced. And then there's sleep. When you don't get enough sleep, your body makes less melatonin, which is the hormone that regulates your sleep-wake cycle. And guess what? It makes more cortisol. So not getting enough sleep is a double whammy for your hormones.
So skimping on sleep isn't just making you feel groggy, it's actually messing with your hormones.
Yep. Aim for 7 or 8 hours of good quality sleep every night. Wind down before bed. Avoid caffeine and alcohol. Make sure your room's dark and cool. Create a relaxing bedtime routine that works for you.
What about diet? Does what we eat affect our hormones?
Big time. Some foods can really mess with hormone production and function. Think processed foods, sugary drinks, unhealthy fats. All of that can lead to inflammation and insulin resistance, which throws off your hormone levels and increases your risk for all sorts of problems.
So those are the bad guys. What are some foods that can actually help us keep our hormones in check?
Focus on whole, unprocessed foods. Load up on colorful fruits and veggies, whole grains, lean protein, and healthy fats like those found in avocados, nuts, and olive oil. It's about giving your body the nutrients it needs to do its job.
So basically, a balanced and colorful diet is good for your hormones too, not just your waistline.
Exactly. Now, let's not forget about the environment. Exposure to certain toxins can definitely have an impact on your endocrine system.
So it's not just about what we eat, but also the products we use and the places we spend time in.
Right. Things like pesticides, heavy metals, and those endocrine disrupting chemicals that are in some plastics and personal care products can really interfere with how your hormones work. They basically mimic hormones and trick your body, which throws everything off balance.
So what can we do to protect ourselves?
Read labels carefully, choose natural and organic products whenever you can, and try to minimize your exposure to those potential toxins. It's about being proactive and protecting your endocrine system.
We've talked a lot about external factors, but what about genetics? Are some people just predisposed to having hormone problems?
Genes definitely play a role. Some endocrine disorders, like type 1 diabetes and certain thyroid problems, have a strong genetic component. So if it runs in your family, you might be at a higher risk. But remember, genes aren't everything.
So even if you have a family history, it doesn't mean you're guaranteed to have problems, right?
Right. Your lifestyle makes a huge difference. By making healthy choices, you can often offset those genetic risks.
It's good to know we have some control no matter what our genes are. Now, I want to talk about a topic that comes up a lot when we're talking about hormones. Hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. Can you explain what that is?
HRT is basically using medication to replace hormones that are either missing or declining. It's most often used to treat menopause symptoms in women. For example, estrogen therapy can help with hot flashes, night sweats, vaginal dryness, and other things that happen when estrogen levels drop during menopause.
I know there's been a lot of back and forth about HRT. What are the risks and benefits people should be aware of?
Yeah, it's definitely been controversial. Some studies had suggested that HRT might increase the risk for things like breast cancer, heart disease, and stroke. But other studies have shown that it can actually be beneficial for some women, especially if they started early in menopause. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
So it's something you really need to discuss with your doctor, weighing those potential benefits and risks.
Exactly. It's a personal decision, and your doctor can help you figure out what's right for you.
Are there other kinds of HRT besides estrogen therapy for menopause?
Oh yeah, definitely. Testosterone replacement therapy is sometimes used for men who have low testosterone levels, which can cause fatigue, low libido, and other symptoms. And we talked earlier about thyroid hormone replacement for people with hypothyroidism. The important thing is to use HRT carefully under the supervision of a doctor and watch out for any side effects.
It sounds like HRT can be a valuable tool, but it's not something to take lightly. Okay, so let's get back to the world of hormones and talk about their role in growth and development. What are some of the key players that orchestrate all of that?
Well, when we're talking about growth hormone is the MVP. It's made by the pituitary gland, and it's what helps kids and teenagers grow taller. But it also plays a role in metabolism, bone health, and muscle mass throughout adulthood.
So it's not just for kids.
Nope. It's important for everyone. And if there's a problem with growth hormone production, it can cause issues. If there's not enough, kids might not grow as tall as they should. And in adults, it can affect bone density, muscle mass, and energy levels.
What about too much growth hormone? We talked about acromegaly before, but what happens if a kid has too much?
In kids, too much growth hormone can lead to gigantism, which means they grow to be abnormally tall. basically like acromegaly, but it happens before the growth plates in the bones have closed, so they just keep growing.
So getting that growth hormone balance right is crucial, especially when kids are growing. Okay, let's dive into another area where hormones are super important: reproduction. The endocrine system is basically the conductor of the whole symphony of hormones that control everything from puberty to pregnancy and beyond. What are some of the big hormonal changes that drive those processes?
It all starts with puberty, when kids go through those huge physical and emotional changes. The hypothalamus, which is this tiny but powerful part of the brain, sends signals to the pituitary gland to release hormones that stimulate the ovaries in girls and the testes in boys.
So the brain is calling the shots?
Yep. And those signals from the brain tell those reproductive glands to start making those key sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone in girls, and testosterone in boys. Those hormones are what drive those changes we see during puberty, like breast development and menstruation in girls, and facial hair and a deeper voice in boys.
Those are some pretty big changes, and it's amazing that it's all controlled by these little molecules. Let's talk about the menstrual cycle. It's like a monthly dance of hormones getting the body ready for a possible pregnancy. Can you break it down for us?
Every month, the ovaries go through this whole cycle of follicle development, ovulation, and then getting ready for a potential pregnancy. And it's all carefully orchestrated by these hormones. At the beginning of the cycle, FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, basically encourages those follicles in the ovaries to grow. And as those follicles grow, they make estrogen, which thickens the lining of the uterus. So it's like getting the house ready for a potential guest.
So estrogen is setting the stage.
Exactly. And then, right around the middle of the cycle, there's this surge of LH, or luteinizing hormone, which triggers ovulation. That's when a mature egg is released from one of those follicles. And after ovulation, the follicle that released the egg turns into something called the corpus luteum, which makes progesterone. Progesterone's job is to keep that uterine lining thick and make it even more welcoming for a fertilized egg.
It's like passing the baton from one hormone to the next.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if fertilization doesn't happen, that corpus luteum breaks down, progesterone levels drop, and the uterine lining sheds, which is what we know as menstruation. So it's this cycle of getting ready and then resetting month after month.
What happens if a woman does get pregnant?
Pregnancy triggers a whole other cascade of hormonal changes, even bigger than those of the menstrual cycle. One of the first signs is a surge in a hormone called HCG, which stands for human chorionic gonadotropin. That's the hormone that pregnancy tests pick up. The developing placenta produces HCG, and it helps maintain that corpus luteum so progesterone levels stay high and support the pregnancy.
So HCG is like a signal flare, letting the body know that a baby's on the way.
Exactly. And then estrogen and progesterone levels keep going up and up throughout the pregnancy. They help the uterus grow, the placenta develop, and the breasts get ready for breastfeeding. It's really remarkable how all of this happens.
It's amazing how the body just knows what to do. What happens after the baby is born?
After childbirth, those hormone levels plummet. Estrogen and progesterone go way down, which can cause things like postpartum mood swings. But the body is also making other hormones, like prolactin, which stimulates milk production, and oxytocin, which helps with bonding between mom and baby. So it's a time of huge hormonal adjustment.
We've talked about puberty and pregnancy. What about menopause? What's happening hormonally during that stage of life?
Menopause is basically the end of a woman's reproductive years. The ovaries stop producing as much estrogen and progesterone, and that drop in hormones can lead to a whole bunch of symptoms like hot flashes, night sweats, vaginal dryness, trouble sleeping, mood swings, all sorts of things.
So menopause is like the reverse of puberty.
You could say that. It's another time of big hormonal shifts as the body transitions out of that reproductive phase. And while menopause is a natural part of life, it can be really tough, both physically and emotionally. But there are things that can help, like lifestyle changes, alternative therapies, and sometimes even hormone replacement therapy, like we talked about earlier.
We've covered so much ground today talking about all these different hormones. I'm curious, are there any ways to test your hormone levels at home? Like those at-home testing kits? Are those legit?
There are some at-home hormone tests out there, but it's important to be careful. They're not all created equal, and the results might not be totally accurate or give you the full picture. If you're really concerned about your hormones, it's always best to talk to your doctor.
So those at-home tests could be a starting point, but it's better to get professional advice.
Exactly. You want to make sure you're getting the right information and the right guidance, not just trying to figure it out on your own.
Okay, so before we wrap up this whole hormone extravaganza, I want to touch on something that's especially important for women who are pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant: Thyroid health. Why is that so important?
Thyroid hormones are super important for a baby's brain development. If a woman has a thyroid deficiency during pregnancy, it can have serious consequences for the baby, like intellectual disabilities and other developmental problems.
So it's not just about the mom's health, but also about the baby's?
Exactly. That's why doctors routinely check thyroid function during pregnancy, just to be safe. And if there's a deficiency, they can prescribe thyroid hormone replacement therapy to make sure both mom and baby are getting what they need.
It's another example of how hormones are essential throughout our entire lives. Okay, before we move on, I want to ask you, what's the one thing you hope people take away from this conversation about the endocrine system?
For me, it's really about understanding that it's all connected. The endocrine system doesn't work in a vacuum. It's constantly interacting with all the other systems in your body, and it's essential for overall health.
So taking care of your endocrine system is part of taking care of your whole self.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everything is linked and making choices that support your whole body.
That's a great point. Our endocrine systems are amazing, and the more we learn about them, the better we can take care of ourselves.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to reach out to your doctor if you have any concerns. They can help you understand this fascinating system and create a plan that's right for you. It's really incredible, isn't it? All those hormones working together to keep everything in balance. It's like this intricate dance going on behind the scenes.
I like that. An intricate dance. And the endocrine system doesn't work alone, right? It's constantly talking to other systems, like the nervous system.
Oh, absolutely. You can almost think of them as two sides of the same coin. They both work to maintain that balance in the body. But the nervous system acts really fast with those electrical signals. And then the endocrine system is slower, more long-term regulation with the hormones.
So they're both essential, working together.
Exactly. That's how you can react to something suddenly, like, almost getting into a car accident with that burst of adrenaline from the nervous system. But then it's the hormones from the endocrine system that keep your energy levels steady throughout the day. It's a real partnership.
We've talked about a lot of specific endocrine disorders today, but I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, lifestyle choices. It seems like what we do every day can really affect that delicate balance, even if we don't have a specific medical condition.
That's one of the most important things I hope people remember from this whole conversation. While some endocrine disorders are mostly about genetics, a lot of them are influenced by the choices we make. You could think of it like tending a garden. If you give it what it needs, the right soil, the right amount of sunlight and water, it'll usually thrive. But if you neglect those things, it starts to wilt.
So, how do we tend the garden of our endocrine system? What can we do every day to keep our hormones happy?
Well, it all starts with the basics, right? A healthy diet. Just imagine your endocrine system thriving on those colorful whole foods. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean protein, healthy fats. And on the flip side, all those processed foods, sugary drinks, unhealthy fats, those are the things that can cause inflammation and throw your hormones way out of whack.
So, it's about giving your body the nutrients it needs to produce those hormones and keep everything running smoothly.
Exactly. And just like a garden needs water, our bodies need exercise. Being physically active helps regulate blood sugar, it makes your cells more sensitive to insulin, it boosts your metabolism, it even helps manage stress. All of those things contribute to a healthier endocrine system.
It's like exercise is a multivitamin for your hormones.
Like that. And then there's sleep, which we've talked about quite a bit. Sleep is so crucial. It's when your body does all of its major repair work. Aim for 7 to 8 hours every night, good quality sleep. Have a relaxing bedtime routine. Dim the lights. Put away those screens. Make sure your room is cool and dark. It's about making sleep a priority.
So, it's not just about how much sleep you get, but also how well you sleep.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the importance of stress management. We talked about how chronic stress can really mess with your hormones. So find what works for you, whether it's meditation, yoga, spending time in nature, or just taking a few deep breaths throughout the day. Those things can make a huge difference.
It's all about creating a sense of calm in the middle of all the craziness of daily life.
That's it. And remember those environmental toxins we talked about. Try to reduce your exposure to things like pesticides, heavy metals, and those endocrine disrupting chemicals. Read labels carefully, choose natural and organic products whenever possible, and support policies that protect our environment.
So, it's about being mindful of what we put in our bodies, how we move our bodies, how we manage our stress levels, and even the environments we live in.
It's really a holistic approach,
Yeah.
recognizing that everything is connected. Our choices have an impact on our hormonal balance, and our hormones impact everything else.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into the endocrine system. It's amazing how much these tiny hormones control.
It really is.
Yeah.
And even though we've covered a lot today, there's always more to learn, isn't there?
Absolutely. The endocrine system is so complex, but I think the most important thing is for people to realize that they have the power to influence their hormonal health. By making healthy choices, we can support our endocrine systems and improve our overall well-being.
I completely agree. And remember, if you have any concerns, don't hesitate to talk to your doctor. They can help you understand this incredible system and create a plan that's right for you. It's about working together to achieve optimal health.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the world of endocrine disorders. We hope you found it informative and empowering. We'll see you next time, and until then, stay curious and keep learning.